Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the second webinar in our green or sustainability themed series of webinars. We have a few people still logging on, but we'll make a start because we have committed to keeping you no more than 45 minutes from your day job. My name is Ben Stansfield. I'm a partner in the firm's environmental law group, and I'm delighted to see that already some of this morning's delegates were with us for our COVID post-COVID sustainable growth webinar, but I'm also very pleased to see some new names amongst delegates. So thank you very much for joining us. Today we're going to be talking about environmental and sustainability issues in the context of international trade issues. We were going to be covering state aid issues, but unfortunately our speaker, Bernadine Atkins, has been called into client crisis and is unable to make today's event. So Bernadine sends her apologies. But we still have two excellent speakers, and I will proudly introduce Ursula and Savannah in a moment. But first, a little bit of housekeeping. The webinar will be 45 minutes, give or take. We'll speak for about half an hour and then invite questions from those of you online. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please ask questions throughout, and we'll cover as many as we can at the end. We are recording today's webinar, and we'll send a link round to you later, and you can either watch back or share that link with your colleagues. And finally, at the end of the webinar, we'll send you a survey link. Please do give us the feedback because that helps us shape our content in future. So today I'm really privileged to share a virtual platform with two of my colleagues. We have Ursula Johnston, who's a director in our EU Trade and Competition Practice. Ursula is a global trade specialist and assists many of our clients overcome their compliance challenges in the fields of customs, excise duties, and cross-border regulatory matters, including export controls. We're also joined by Savannah Wold, one of our trainee solicitors. Savannah is a trainee in the Trade and Competition Group, and she works very closely with Ursula, assisting clients with their free trade issues, in particular as a result of Brexit. Savannah will be talking to us about free trade agreements and how they deal with environmental issues, and Ursula will cover talk to us about the advent of free ports. But we have a Bernadine-sized hole in our programme, and Ursula has very kindly agreed to step in and give us an update on the international trade landscape. So thank you very much for doing that. Take notice, Ursula. But before I hand over to Ursula and Savannah, I thought I would take my my chair's privilege and just set the scene from an environmental law perspective rather than a trade lawyer's perspective. As we said in our first webinar, climate change issues have never had such a high profile as they currently do. And although COVID-19 has pushed the green agenda perhaps off the front page down to page 2, it's still pretty significant, and there's a lot of talk about green growth. And whilst the green agenda hasn't really been spoken about as loudly in the UK as an environmentalist like me would really like, and I'm talking about the last sort of 12 months since we legislated for net zero, and not just since the start of the current crisis, there have been a few positive noises recently. So Alok Sharma, our business secretary, has assembled a Green Recovery Working Group, and our Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, gave a speech recently, and he said, look, there's no choice between cutting greenhouse gas emissions and growing the economy. You have to do both at the same time. But in contrast to the UK, the EU has been really busy. It published the Green Deal in December 19, which is effectively a roadmap for how the European Union will get to net zero. It's adopted in European Industrial Strategy this year, and it's also published a biodiversity strategy. Now, those documents aren't just a vegan environmentalist's, environmental nerd stream like me. There's plenty in there about increasing land and water under special environmental protection and reduction in pesticides that's going to increase pollinators, stuff that gets me very excited. But there's a lot in there, lots that the EU is proposing to do to improve sustainability and environmental protection that will really impact how international trade works. And I want to share just very briefly some of those issues. So there's talk about the European Emissions Trading Scheme being enlarged to include other sectors, for example, commercial property and transport. Now that's going to really help ensure effective and stable carbon pricing across the EU. The more businesses will be subject to it, more businesses will have to purchase and surrender allowances equivalent to their carbon emissions. Now that's got the potential for carbon leakage, and that's what happens when production is transferred from the EU, where carbon prices regulation makes production expensive. to jurisdictions where carbon prices are less strictly regulated. But if those countries don't share the EU's ambition with respect to sustainability and environmental issues, we can expect a carbon border adjustment mechanism for certain sectors, so the price of imports will effectively and accurately reflect their true carbon content. The circular economy is going to be developed, so measures will be introduced in the European Union that will encourage businesses to offer products that are more durable, more reusable and capable of being repaired. Consumers will have a right to repair. So how is that going to affect imports of goods from outside the EU? And in transport terms, the EU ETS will likely welcome the shipping centre and aviation will receive fewer allowances in the future. And the EU is talking about regulating access to European ports for the most polluting ships. So that's bound to impact how we can get goods into the single market. And some of you might be thinking, well, look, that's just the EU, Ben. You know, there are plenty of other countries with whom we can trade, but the EU is really ambitious, and this is a state's ambition in the Green Deal to influence. It talks a lot about Green Deal diplomacy. It wants to set a credible example, and it wants to really impact trade policy. And it said, look, we're going to talk to the UN about this. We're going to have a charm offensive with the G7, the G20, the WTO. And if you remember, the G20 is responsible for 80% of global greenhouse gas emissions. There's a great deal that the EU thinks it can achieve. The EU has identified the EU-China summits in Leipzig at the end of 2020 as an opportunity to reinforce its climate messages. China is the largest emitter of CO2 in the world, and the EU sees that as a real opportunity to make some environmental progress. And it's the same issue with the EU-Africa summit in October. The green transition is actually at the top of the agenda for those talks. So why is the EU on this mission? Well, it recognises climate change is the biggest threat to humanity, and I'm sure it has sound environmental and moral motivations in doing this. But the EU also recognises very publicly that climate change represents instability. Climate change affects the ecological transition. It's going to reshape geopolitics, trade, security, economic interests. It's going to impact societies. We're going to have conflicts, food insecurity, population displacement, and what have you. So climate has to be at the centre of every decision the EU makes, including in relation to trade. So that's enough from me with my environmental law hat on, but I hope that's helped set the scene a little and made the link between environmental policy aspirations and its impact on trade. And I'd now like to hand over to Ursula and Savannah.
Thanks, Ben. So just to go one step further with Ben's very kind introduction to Savannah and myself and the team that we work in. So traditionally, historically, we've been advising clients on their trading activities, how to move goods from A to B, what are the costs and what are the risks associated with that. However, as the UK has now committed to withdrawing from the EU, we are getting increasingly more queries from clients saying, well, how will UK international trade policy, how will that affect my business? And I think, therefore, I think just sort of right now, as we look at, the UK and the EU have completed their fourth round of negotiations, it's really timely to think about environment and sustainability and how how that can be interwoven with trade policy decision making. And I also think as well, I think as we hopefully, or at least the UK and the EU, as we start to move out of the immediate COVID-19 crisis, I think as well businesses will be again addressing that battle of globalization versus regionalization or nationalization of their supply chains. And of course, that has a significant impact, not only from a sort of a trade and trade policy and trade agreements perspective, but also again from an environment and sustainability side as well. So I think it's a great day today to be talking, and particularly as I understand as well, they've opened up in the coming days, they're going to announce air bridges, so we will be able to go on holiday to Spain after all. This wasn't going to be the platform to mention Brexit, but since we are at a very pivotal stage in the negotiations, I thought I'd just give you a short summary of where I believe the UK is. So I think it's the broad consensus is there is political will on both sides to reach a deal by the end of the year. I think it's accepted, and this again comes into our discussions around sustainability and environment, that there will be regulatory divergence. The EU has moved away from trying to get the UK to commit to dynamic alignment. So that would mean that the UK would have to peg itself to changes in EU regulations. So whereas my expectation is the UK will broadly copy and paste many of the existing UK regulations around environment and sustainability, it will not be held to those on a go forward basis, so as the EU develops new policies. Where do I think the sticking points are right now? I think it's tariffs on agriculture and obviously access to EU fishing water. I think what we can expect, particularly in these more sensitive areas, we can expect phasing in periods, grace periods of standstill, but giving businesses or farmers more time to prepare for the potential tariff and non-tariff barrier changes. I think what's very clear is we're going to move far away from the current single market regime. And somebody, I attended a conference a couple of days ago where we discussed, well, when will we have sight of that trade deal? When will businesses be able to say, well, look, this is my, these are the duty rates I face. These are the provisions around labour, employment, environment, data sharing, etc. I think it's going to come down to the wire. I think October still feels quite ambitious because typically in trade negotiations, the big decisions, the big sticking points will only get resolved at the very last minute, and it's about who blinks first. I think that's probably enough around Brexit, but I want to take a step back from Brexit now and think about, well, what governs international trade, so that we can scene set the comments and the commentary that Savannah is going to give later on. So I'm sure in the last couple of years, everyone's been talking around this idea of a WTO type style of trading relationship with the EU, MFN trade terms. But it's true, our global trading landscape is broadly governed by framework principles that have been established by the World Trade Organization. And under the World Trade Organization, they are responsible for implementing and developing two informal agreements, which are the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and the General Agreement on Trade and Services. Now, neither of those agreements really have any mention of environment and sustainability. And one of the reasons for that is that they haven't really changed very much in the last 20 to 30 years. They're very different. Remember, if you think you have 195 plus members of the WTO, trying to reach consensus on changing the text of any of those agreements is incredibly difficult. And and we set that further in the context of current trade wars between China and the US. There is very little appetite right now for the major trading major trading nations to go back into that text, because broadly they don't think it holds very much value for them. So what we have now with the WTO lacking really any teeth, is we see increasingly individual countries or individual groups of countries looking to negotiate bilateral or what we call multilateral trade agreements. And that's where we now see the interplay between environment and sustainability policy and trade, because those trade agreements will typically include a chapter whereby each party to the agreement commit to uphold or implement particular standards that will mostly broadly reflect their existing domestic policy in this area. And a trade agreement covers, on the one hand, it covers tariffs. So it will say, well, if you allow me to import potatoes with no duty, on the other hand, I'll allow you to import microchips with no duty into my territory. So it looks to see what are the potential gains for the members and how can they increase domestic living standards. So I think what we see with environmental provisions in these trade agreements is that they tend to be a gear, not an engine. They're not driving the FTA negotiating process. However, as Savannah will touch upon later, it can be used as potentially a lever to push one of the negotiating parties into a particular direction. I think the other thing to remember, and this is less so the case for the UK and the EU right now, but trade negotiations can last for 10 plus years. So if you can imagine, you can come into a platform for trade negotiations thinking, well, you know, and national governments have their own agenda on this area, but when it comes to signing off and implementing those agreements 10 years later, national policies may well have changed. And then I think the last point to sort of raise around trade agreements and those policies is that there's a lack of enforcement around them. So in the course of doing this research, because I have to say this wasn't something that Savannah and I had spent a lot of time doing historically, was we really found very few, if I don't think we found any incidences where a commitment to adopting a particular environmental or sustainable provision in the FTA chapter had been enforced by another party. Typically, disputes tend to raise around state aid and non-tariff barriers to trade. I think one example I just wanted to go through before I talk to Savannah, before I hand over to Savannah, was the China-Australia trade agreement. And this is where you can see what were the interests of those parties when they were negotiating that trade agreement. Well, basically, Australia wanted to sell the results of mining, so iron ore, to make steel, minerals, that, you know, precious minerals, etc. And therefore, to try to have a chapter in that trade agreement that held either Australia or China to a particular high level of environmental or sustainability policy would have been very difficult to see why that would have, you had clearly then a conflict of interest. So I think that's what I wanted to sort of say generally around theme setting and trade. And now I'm going to hand over to Savannah, who's going to discuss some more specific examples.
Thank you, Ursula. So I'm going to talk now about the interaction between sustainability and trade agreements. So the relationship between trade and the environment is complex, and there's quite a clear conflict from the outset. Naturally, if you increase the level of trade, particularly over a long distance between continents, or where you've got a global supply chain, you're looking at the use of aircraft and shipping, which has an impact on the environment in terms of the exporter and importer's carbon footprint, and also contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. However, increasing trade through the conclusion of trade agreements can have many positive effects, both economically and socially, particularly in increasing efficiencies in the supply chain. So trade agreements provide a great opportunity for issues around climate change and sustainability to be addressed, and also a means of facilitating cooperation between countries to work together to improve environmental standards globally. And as Ursula mentioned earlier, they can be used as leverage for improving environmental standards. So if we take the recent example of the discussions between the UK and the ASEAN region, if we look at Malaysia, where the government has declared a moratorium on palm oil expansion to protect forest cover at 50%, and also to enforce sustainability standards in palm oil production in Malaysia. So this really shows how trade negotiation could be used to better environmental standards, and that would be a really positive effect. So if we consider some of the free trade agreements recently concluded, or which are currently under negotiation between the EU and third countries, it provides a helpful insight into how sustainability and the environment are being considered. So what have we seen in modern EU trade agreements? Well, as Ursula mentioned, these do contain a chapter typically on trade and sustainable development. And some of the rules imposed on the EU and its trade partners relate to following international labour and environmental standards and agreements, effectively enforcing their environmental and labour laws, sustainably trading natural resources such as fish and timber, not deviating from environmental laws to encourage trade or investment, encouraging trade that supports climate change, and also promoting practices that promote corporate social responsibility. And the EU also uses its trade agreements to promote sustainable procurement and also the removal of barriers to trade and investment in renewable energy. So during major trade negotiations, the Commission also uses sustainability impact assessments, which analyse the potential economic, social, human rights and environmental impact of ongoing trade negotiations. And in practice, it also meets with its partners regularly to discuss how they in the EU are implementing trade and sustainable development commitments in the agreements between them. So now if we look in particular at some of the agreements that have been concluded, or in the process of being concluded, such as the EU-Mercosur agreement. If you look at the agreement in principle, it's based on the premise that increased trade should not come at the expense of the environment or labour conditions, and on the contrary, it should promote sustainable development. And in a specific article on climate change, they agreed to strong language committing to effectively implement the Paris Agreement and also to cooperate on the trade and climate change interface. And this is something that the European Commission has stressed is covered by the agreement. It also lists a number of areas of potential cooperation regarding the sustainable management of forests, as well as responsible business conduct. The chapter also, as Ursula mentioned about enforcement earlier, it contains a specific dispute settlement procedure under which a complaint concerning non-compliance is first considered in formal government consultations. So it does deal quite closely with trade and sustainable development. And similarly with the EU-Mexico agreement, which they've just wrapped up 4 years of negotiations in April this year, it's got a trade and sustainable development chapter, including provisions on the fight against climate change and also the transition to a sustainable low carbon economy, and also makes reference to the Paris Agreement as the EU-Mercosur agreement does as well. And it also identifies potential areas where trade and climate change agendas can reinforce each other, such as the conservation and sustainable management of biological resources, forests and fisheries, and also the promotion of trade in legally harvested and sustainable products. It also deals with endangered species of, for example, wild fauna and flora, and other agreements that are key international instruments. Now, if we look at the EU-Canada trade agreement, known as CETA, this also has a chapter on trade and sustainable development, and also a separate chapter on trade and the environment. And these also contain special recognitions, specific recognitions and agreements by the parties. For example, they recognise that it's inappropriate to encourage trade or investment by weakening or reducing the levels of protection afforded to in their environmental law. They also agree to engage in dialogue and consult with each other in relation to trade-related sustainable development issues of common interest. And they also recognise that economic growth, social development and environmental protection are all interlinked. And there's also specific provisions in relation to trade favouring environmental protection, such as agreeing to make efforts to facilitate and promote trade and investment in environmental goods and services, through including the reduction of non-tariff barriers related to these particular goods and services. Now, if we take a step back and look at the trading relationship between the EU and South Africa, this trade agreement was concluded back in 1999. but it still does have a section on the environment. In particular, the parties agree to cooperate to pursue sustainable development through rational use of non-renewable natural resources and the sustainable use of renewable natural resources. And it also contains some provisions around sustainability, for example, in the context of improving access to affordable, reliable and sustainable sources of energy, and also supports cooperations between countries in Southern Africa to exploit locally available energy resources in an efficient and environmentally friendly way. And it also promotes sustainable development in relation to tourism. So we think that this really shows that from an EU perspective, sustainability and environmental concerns have been on the agenda for a while. Now, sustainability is not just the focus of EU agreements. This is something that we're seeing to various degrees of specificity in trade agreements globally. So, for example, if you look at the US, Mexico and Canada agreement, which was formally signed this year and is in the process of being ratified, within this agreement there is also a whole chapter dedicated to environmental issues, and it's fairly lengthy, approximately 31 pages in total, and it sets out the scope and objectives, which include, again, recognition by the parties that a healthy environment is integral to sustainable development, and also recognising that contribution to trade makes sustainable development. And also in terms of the objectives of this chapter, it's to promote mutually supportive trade and environmental practices and policies, promote high levels of environmental protection and the effective enforcement of environmental laws, and also to enhance the parties' capacities to address trade-related environmental issues through, again, cooperation and aiming to further sustainable development. The US-Mexico-Canada agreement also contains specific environmental issues are addressed, such as protecting the ozone layer, protection of the marine environment from ship pollution, air quality, and also marine litter. Now, if we look at the agreement between China and Australia that Ursula mentioned earlier, it's quite a lot lighter on this, and there isn't an environmental chapter as such. The environment is mentioned briefly in the investment chapter, but it's more an exception to obligations under the agreement, such as, for example, in relation to measures which would not constitute arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination or a disguised restriction on trade. Then nothing in the agreement would prevent a party from implementing measures necessary to protect human, animal or plant life, or relating to the conservation of exhaustible and living and non-living resources. And also protection of the environment is listed as sort of a general exception to the chapters, some of the chapters in chapter. So that is a brief overview of some of the provisions in the various trade agreements that are in negotiation or concluded, and I'll pass you back to Ursula, who's going to talk a bit about free ports.
Anna, that's brilliant. I think something just when you were just talking about the US, the recent US-Mexico-Canada agreement, I think what would be very interesting is if you could get an insight into the negotiators' thinking, particularly from the US, because they've obviously been one of the reasons they renegotiated the whole agreement was because they wanted to make sure that Mexico could not undercut US manufacturers. And I suspect the environment policies around the environment and labour, for example, have been used as a bit of a tool to ensure that Mexico brings up its manufacturing costs and level and commitments, so that US manufacturers can compete more evenly in that region. I thought since this, I'm sure today we've got planning lawyers on the webinar. I wanted to touch just briefly on somewhat of a new regime that the UK is looking to introduce post Brexit, and that's free ports in conjunction with what we call special economic zones. Now, the reason why I think it's important to raise this and to have this, this is going to come down the track, is that potentially the idea of these free ports and special economic zones is to encourage investment in particular areas of the UK, in particular the northeast, and those may be around existing ports, but they could also be sort of virtual zones or inland terminals. So what these free ports aim to do is to provide a specific geographical area that it attracts investors and capital by perhaps loosening some of the restrictions around planning and permitted development rights. And they are aiming to create what we would call an innovation hub with regulatory flexibility. So you can see from an environmental perspective that already there are concerns coming that whilst on the one hand, yes, it's good that we need to boost the UK economy, in particular in some of the poorer regions, is this going to rub up against UK environmental policy? So what I thought was just to run through. So the current free ports would aim to help lower the cost of imports for businesses by creating a tariff-free zone, a zone where you don't pay customs duties and most likely import VAT. And part of that is to say as well, if you're a business, you're a manufacturer, if you're going to develop new technologies, we want you to come and do that in the UK, and we'll give you a soft landing zone in terms of your regulatory commitments. So there's a UK government consultation that I think was due to close in March, but now has been extended to the 13th of July. So if you're interested in sort of looking at what those free ports propose in terms of the different sort of areas of liberalisation, it's worth having a look and potentially responding to that survey if you think it has particular interest for you as an individual or the organisation that you run for, that you work for. I don't think I want to say too much on where the conflicts are, because I'm not the environmental specialist, I'm not the planner, but I think just something to keep on your radar. I'm going to hand back to Ben as our moderator, as I know we are getting close to our end of our 40-minute slot.
Okay, thank you both very much for that. We've had a couple of questions in. Please do use the Q&A function if you've got questions. I've had a couple of questions direct to me, and we've had a couple. Henry, thank you for your questions. I suspect one of them may be better asked on a different forum, and the other one's perhaps a little bit too political for today's webinar. But thank you for asking them anyway. Savannah, you talked about free trade agreements, and actually I was surprised to hear that, since 1999, the South Africa free trade agreement, we've been having environmental provisions or environmental chapters in these. Do you think free trade agreements are a way of improving standards, environmental standards?
That's a good question. I think free trade agreements do provide a great opportunity for matters such as sustainability and the environment to be addressed, and climate change as well. And especially because often with trade agreements, you have agreements between countries in different continents. As Ursula mentioned, they're sort of global, so there's more of a global impact. So if FTAs or trade agreements in general can facilitate cooperation between countries to work together and confirm their commitments to the environment and sustainable measures, then they do provide a great avenue for improving environmental standards generally and more globally. Particularly a lot of the free trade agreements that I mentioned between the EU and third countries, with the more modern agreements, they do contain these chapters. But as these agreements were concluded relatively recently, it will be interesting to see what effect they have on the environment and sustainability going forward. And I don't know if Ursula, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, and I think obviously the UK to certain to sort of fairly great extent has been looking to what we call roll over the existing EU trade agreements. But I think what I think will be interesting to see is to what extent it wants to leave itself some wriggle room to diverge, because it doesn't want dynamic regulatory alignment with the EU. And therefore, I know that not only environment and sustainability, but there are other areas, other chapters in those FTAs where the UK is thinking very carefully about not making sure that it leaves its own room to create its own future policies, and making sure that those policies are fit for purpose, particularly in a time where you think the UK is trying to negotiate trade deals which perhaps traditionally would have taken 10 years to conclude, and in a matter of 6 weeks, for example, in the case of Japan and the UK.
Sorry, I had another question. You mentioned that environmental issues were sort of a gear rather than the engine. And obviously, I read the Green Deal and get very excited as an environmental lawyer. It's just, the world's going to be a different place, which is fabulous and exciting. So do you think that gear is going to get larger? Do you think that environment will start driving trade, or is the UK always going to? So I guess that's a question for the EU. And will the UK tag along and sort of just copy and paste what the EU have done, or will we just be so desperate to get the FTAs done we'll agree to anything?
Well, I expect, and perhaps this is answering it slightly, I expect the EU and the US, the UK, etc., will be looking for much of this adoption of policies to be driven at a business level. So they will want businesses to uphold those standards and push their own agendas, which on the one hand, yes, we want to liberalize global trade, but on the other, we want to make sure that we are going to have a business environment which upholds those commitments. So I suspect that actually the pressure will come from top down, and businesses will increasingly need to make sure that they keep this on their growth agenda.
Okay, thank you. And then the final question I have that's come through is, you mentioned a lack of enforcement in your research. What would that look like if there had been enforcement?
So I think everyone would be sort of fairly familiar with the ongoing, we have the ongoing disputes between, say, China and the US, and those are outside the WTO, because they're relying on provisions in those agreements which say, well, if you, for example, you want to declare a national emergency, well, you can impose tariffs on steel. We go to the next phase is when members of the WTO will bring a complaint to the WTO panel and ask for adjudication. Now, the issue that the WTO has at the moment, it does not have a sitting appellate body, not have enough judges appointed to carry out, to manage any disputes. So what I suspect is, and those disputes are normally around tariffs, so they're around, well, how much money are we paying to get, how much money do I have to pay if I want to import my products into your territory? What I suspect would happen in these areas around environment and sustainability is it would be much more on what I would call a delegate basis. So I know that, for example, under the EU Mercosur agreement, is they will have every 2-3 years, they will establish subcommittees that go and sit together in a room and they discuss how successfully different chapters of the agreement have been implemented and whether there are any questions that need addressing. But I'd find it difficult to think of an example where you would take disputes around perhaps a breach of the chapter or a perceived breach of the chapter on environment up to WTO level.
Okay, thank you. And then Ursula, we've had a question in sort of highlighting that there's a conflict, isn't there, between some of the investment chapters, for industries which might drive, for example, deforestation and logging, and the environmental chapters. Obviously, there is a conflict. How is that justified, or how is that dealt with, or or is that going to become more and more attention going forward?
I think that's going to become, I don't know the answer, to be honest. I think we would need to talk, we need to think about this sort of in a holistic of the whole negotiation process. It's a really good question, but I can imagine, yeah, we're going to have more and more conflicts, particularly as we, you know, if I look at data as well, how do we share data globally versus and to support movements of goods and services? I think that's another example of where, on the one hand, countries, some countries want to monetize that data. On the other, for example, the EU take a much more protectionist outlook. So I think as we have these peripheral chapters to the trade agreements, those questions, that question of conflict will become much sharper.
Okay. All right. Mindful of time, I think we'll wrap up there. So on behalf of Ursula, Savannah and myself, thank you for joining us today, and obviously on behalf of all our delegates, Ursula and Savannah, thank you very much for your insights. Do please fill in the feedback forms when you get the link shortly, and please do make a diary note. We've got a couple of more green and sustainability webinars coming your way. So on 30th of July, we'll be talking about how to green your supply chain and your commercial contracts. And then on August 27th, we'll be talking about climate change litigation, which is rising in prominence. So thank you very much for joining us, and goodbye.
Bye.